Have you ever wondered what happens when a father's cruel pride collides with the success of the daughter he threw away 14 years ago? Picture a freezing funeral where the judgmental whispers of a prestigious family are silenced in a single heartbeat. My revenge was not loud or violent. It was a razor-sharp psychological blow where truth was finally revealed, and my mercy became the most ruthless sentence of all. Hello and welcome back to Haley Revenge Stories. I want to be completely honest with you all today. YouTube has recently demonetized our channel, leaving us without the budget needed to keep running. If you enjoy the story today, please consider supporting us with just a $1 donation so we can pay our hardworking team to survive and continue creating these stories for you. You can easily donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the PayPal link in the description or the pinned comment of this video. My name is Eden Gonzalez. I sat inside the cramped interior of my mid-sized rental car, the engine humming a low, steady rhythm against the relentless tapping of the rain. It was a freezing drizzle, the kind that seeped deep into your bones and made the gray skies over the wealthy Boston suburb look even more oppressive. I was 35 years old now, sitting alone in the damp chill. I watched the wipers sweep back and forth across the windshield, blurring the grand, imposing facade of the funeral home. It felt like a cruel joke of the universe that the weather today perfectly mirrored the exact conditions of the night I was thrown out into the streets 14 years ago. The biting chill in the air was exactly the same. The dampness clinging to my skin was the same. The heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on the atmosphere was the same. But I was not the same terrified 21-year-old girl anymore. I turned off the ignition, plunging the car into silence, and stepped out into the mist. I did not carry an umbrella. I walked up the wide stone steps slowly, letting the rain cling to my hair and dampen the shoulders of my dress. I entered the heavy oak doors completely alone. The foyer was stifling, thick with the overwhelming scent of white lilies and the subtle metallic tang of wet wool and aggressively expensive perfumes. I was dressed in a simple, minimalist black dress, devoid of any designer logos, intricate lacework, or ostentatious tailoring. My neck and wrists were bare, completely stripped of the heavy diamond and pearl heirlooms that the women of my family usually wore like heavy armor to these gatherings. As I crossed the threshold into the main parlor, the low murmur of hushed conversations immediately ceased. The silence that followed was heavy and deafening. I could feel the collective weight of dozens of eyes snapping toward me. They were the Gonzalez relatives, aunts, uncles, and cousins, draped in the finest black cashmere and silk, their faces expertly sculpted into expressions of practiced mourning. But as their eyes washed over my unadorned dress and damp hair, the calculated grief melted away, replaced by thinly veiled disdain and ravenous curiosity. I could almost hear their unspoken judgments echoing in the quiet room. To them, I was still the rebellious, failed daughter who had thrown away a gilded empire for absolute nothingness. They looked at my bare neck and assumed poverty. They looked at my solitary entrance and assumed loneliness. I let them look. At the far end of the long, dimly lit room stood the open mahogany casket, and standing right beside it, casting a long, rigid shadow over my mother's resting place, was Hector, my father. He was a notorious real estate tycoon, a man who built his massive fortune on ruthless acquisitions and iron-fisted control. Even in mourning, he wore his authority like a perfectly tailored suit. He saw me the very moment I walked in. I felt his gaze lock onto me from across the vast expanse of the room, sharp and unyielding as a razor blade. He did not move a single muscle to approach me. He merely stood there, his jaw tightly clenched, demanding through sheer presence that I cross the floor and present myself to his domain. I took my time. Each step I took toward the casket was measured and deliberate, my sensible black heels clicking softly against the polished hardwood floor. I kept my eyes fixed on the serene, pale face of my mother resting among the satin pillows, completely ignoring the hostile stares of the family members flanking my path. I needed to say goodbye to her. But just as I reached out, just as I was a mere breath away from the casket, Hector stepped smoothly into my path, effectively blocking me from moving forward. He leaned in close, his posture rigid, and deliberately invaded my personal space. The scent of his bespoke cologne mixed with the sharp smell of stale coffee on his breath. He did not offer comfort. He did not share my grief or offer a hand. Instead, he leaned down and whispered into my ear, his voice dripping with a deep, vindictive satisfaction. "Looks like life finally punished you after all." He fully expected me to shatter right there. He waited for the tears to well up in my eyes, for my shoulders to shake, for the anger and bitter regret to finally break the surface. But I felt nothing of the sort. I did not cry. I did not lash out or defend myself. I stood perfectly still and simply looked up at him. For the first time in my life, I really looked at the man who had terrified me for so long. I saw the deep, bitter wrinkles carving harsh lines around his mouth. I saw the faint tremor in his hands that he tried so desperately to hide. I felt the profound, pathetic insecurity hiding behind his towering arrogance. And looking at this small, aging man, I could only do one thing. I smiled. It was a soft, gentle smile, completely devoid of malice but filled with a quiet, absolute certainty. Hector blinked, a flash of genuine confusion crossing his harsh features, before he quickly scowled and brushed it off, completely unaware of the storm that was about to consume him. That fleeting look of confusion on his face dissolved as my mind pulled me violently backward into the darkest night of my life. 14 years ago, I was exactly 21 years old. I stood in the center of Hector's sprawling, cavernous home office. The room was a monument to his ego, suffocatingly dark, paneled in rich mahogany, and reeking of aged scotch and expensive cigar smoke. My hands were trembling, not from fear, but from a sickening, hollow disgust. I slammed a heavy, overstuffed manila folder onto the pristine surface of his custom desk. The glossy papers spilled out, scattering under the harsh glow of his brass reading lamp. They were eviction notices, forged inspection reports, and predatory loan agreements. I had spent the last 3 weeks digging through the company archives, uncovering the horrifying truth. The new, highly publicized residential project, the crown jewel of the Gonzalez empire, was nothing but a calculated, systematic scam designed to utterly bankrupt thousands of low-income working families. Hector leaned back in his leather chair, barely glancing at the documents. He looked at me with cold, detached annoyance. "What is this nonsense, Eden?" he demanded. "It is the truth," I said, my voice shockingly steady despite the adrenaline pounding in my ears. "It is systemic fraud. You are deliberately destroying the lives of people who have absolutely nothing. You are stealing their life savings to fund your expansion. I will not be a part of this company. I refuse to have my name attached to this blood money, and I am officially canceling the engagement. I will not marry the Moretti heir just to secure your commercial zoning permits." The silence that followed my declaration was absolute and terrifying. The air in the room seemed to freeze. Then, the storm broke. Hector sprang from his chair with a terrifying speed, sweeping his arm violently across the desk. The files, the heavy crystal whiskey glass, the expensive pen holder, all of it went crashing to the floor in a loud shatter of glass and paper. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The veins in his neck bulged aggressively against his collar. To him, this was not a moral disagreement. This was the ultimate betrayal of the bloodline. "You ungrateful, arrogant little brat!" he roared, the sheer volume of his voice vibrating against the heavy wooden doors. "I built this empire with my own 2 hands. I put the food in your mouth, the designer clothes on your back, the roof over your head. You think you can waltz into my office, fresh out of a few college ethics classes, and judge me? You are nothing without this family. You are a naive child who understands absolutely nothing about how the real world operates." He marched around the ruined desk, backing me toward the door. His finger jabbed aggressively at the air mere inches from my face. "Here is how this works," he hissed, his voice dropping into a lethal, venomous register. "You are going to shut your mouth right now. You are going to pick up that garbage on the floor and burn it. You will walk down the aisle next spring and smile for the cameras. You will do exactly as you are told, or you can walk out that front door tonight. But understand this clearly. If you choose to walk out, you leave with absolutely nothing, not a single dime. I will personally call the university tomorrow morning and cut off your tuition for your senior year. Your trust fund will be permanently frozen. Your bank accounts will be drained to zero. You will leave the keys to your car on the table, and you will walk out of here with nothing but the clothes currently on your back. Choose." He fully expected me to break. He expected me to fall to my knees, apologize, and beg to remain in the gilded cage. He truly thought his money was an iron chain I could never break. I looked him dead in the eye, turned on my heel, and walked out of the room. I marched straight through the vast, echoing foyer toward the towering double front doors. Outside, a violent thunderstorm was raging, aggressively rattling the tall, stained glass windows. Hector stalked behind me, his mocking laughter echoing like a physical blow against the cold marble walls. "Go on," he shouted over the deafening crack of thunder. "Walk out into the rain. Let us see exactly how far your cheap, pathetic morality gets you. Your childish idealism will not pay for a meal. You will freeze. You will starve out there in the gutters, Eden. You will be completely ruined. And when you are finally hungry enough, you will crawl back here on your hands and knees, begging for my forgiveness, and I will make you beg." I reached for the heavy brass doorknob. The metal was freezing against my palm. Just as I pulled the massive door open, a slight, desperate movement caught my eye. Halfway up the grand, sweeping staircase, hidden in the shadows of the landing, stood my mother. She was clutching the collar of her silk nightgown, her entire body trembling violently. Her eyes were red, swimming in tears, brimming with an agonizing mixture of absolute heartbreak and complete, paralyzing helplessness. She could not speak. She would never defy him. But in her wide, tear-filled eyes, I saw a silent, desperate plea. She wanted me to run. She wanted me to save myself before I became just like him. I held her gaze for one agonizing second. Then, I stepped out into the freezing, violent downpour. The massive oak doors slammed shut behind me with a sickening, definitive thud, severing me from my past forever. I did not starve in the gutters, though the early years were a grueling, relentless crucible designed to break me. I lived an existence entirely defined by exhaustion, working 18 hours every single day just to survive. I balanced triple shifts carrying heavy trays at a dilapidated diner, pushing my body until my feet went numb, just to keep the heating on in a freezing, microscopic studio apartment. At night, I hunched over textbooks, teaching myself the intricacies of corporate law and finance, funding my final year of university entirely through predatory student loans. Hector's venomous prophecy of my ultimate ruin played on a continuous loop in my head. But instead of crushing my spirit, the hardship burned away all my naivety. I stopped expecting the world to be fair. I became exceptionally sharp, fiercely analytical, and entirely unsentimental. I learned to read the hidden motives of everyone around me, transforming my vulnerability into a weapon of cold, calculating observation. Yet, throughout that dark, exhausting tunnel, I was never completely abandoned. My mother could never openly defy the tyrant she married, but she found her own quiet, beautiful ways to rebel. She never transferred large sums of money, fully aware that Hector monitored every single bank account with paranoid scrutiny. Instead, anonymous packages would arrive at my rundown apartment complex. They were heavy classic novels purchased from thrift stores, Tucked deep between the yellowed pages, I would find crisp $20 bills and tiny handwritten letters on torn pieces of stationery. Occasionally, the payphone outside the diner would ring late at night. I would answer to hear her hushed, trembling voice on the other line, stealing exactly 2 minutes while Hector was out attending a high society gala. She never asked me to apologize to him. She always ended those fleeting, precious calls with the exact same whispered command: "Fly higher than your father's world, Eden." I took her command as absolute law. Armed with my degree and an intimate, terrifying understanding of how corrupt empires operated from the inside out, I built my own dominion. I founded Veritas Axiom. It began quietly in a cramped basement office with a second-hand laptop, operating as a boutique consultancy specializing in corporate intelligence and severe crisis management. Because I was raised by a ruthless predator, I knew exactly how ruthless men hid their dirty secrets. I knew where they buried their financial bodies and how they manipulated the law. By the time I turned 28, Veritas Axiom had rapidly evolved from a solitary operation into a terrifyingly efficient, invisible empire. We became the ultimate shadow architects of the American corporate landscape. We facilitated quiet, hostile takeovers, neutralized catastrophic public relations nightmares, and systematically dismantled corrupt executives before they even realized they were bleeding. Without anyone knowing my face, I held the absolute life and death of dozens of Fortune 500 companies firmly in the palm of my hand. It was precisely in the high-stakes, ruthless crossfire of a multi-billion-dollar corporate acquisition that I met Julian Vance. Julian was a mythic figure in the global financial sector, a man whose mere signature could shift market tides and bankrupt entire industries overnight. When our paths crossed, we were supposed to be brutal adversaries sitting on opposite sides of a boardroom table. Instead, he saw right through my impenetrable armor. He did not care about the Gonzalez family name or my lack of social pedigree. He was entirely captivated by the absolute brilliance of my mind, the terrifying speed of my strategies, and the uncompromising integrity of my methods. We were true intellectual equals, two apex predators who somehow found profound, quiet peace in each other's presence. We married in a completely private ceremony on a secluded coastline, miles away from the flashbulbs of the press. Together, we became the ultimate apex power couple, commanding unimaginable wealth and influence. Yet, we fiercely guarded our private life. To the media, Veritas Axiom was run by a faceless, offshore board of directors. To the public eye, I was simply Julian's quiet, elegant wife. The sharp, overwhelming scent of funeral lilies brought me crashing back to the present moment. I was still standing in the dim parlor, the pathetic echo of Hector's bitter whisper fading into the heavy air. Before he could utter another word, a frail hand gently touched my elbow. I turned slightly to see my Aunt Maria, my mother's youngest sister. She glanced nervously over her shoulder to make sure Hector was not looking, then quickly pressed a small, worn wooden box into my hands. She gave me a deeply sad, knowing nod and slipped silently back into the crowd of mourners. I ran my thumb over the brass latch and opened it. Inside the faded velvet lining lay dozens of carefully folded newspaper clippings and printed articles pulled from top-tier business journals over the last decade. They were all speculative pieces analyzing the brilliant anonymous strategist pulling the strings of corporate America, the phantom CEO they dubbed the Queen of Veritas Axiom. Every single article had specific paragraphs neatly highlighted in yellow ink. My breath caught sharply in my throat, a sudden warmth flooding my chest. My mother had known. Even trapped within the suffocating walls of her gilded cage, she had pieced together the impossible breadcrumbs. She had known exactly who I was, and she had spent the last 14 years proudly watching my every single step from the shadows. The somber atmosphere of the parlor slowly transitioned into the suffocating, performative elegance of the post-funeral tea reception held in the grand, adjoining banquet room. The air was thick with the clinking of fine porcelain teacups, the rustle of expensive black silk, and the low, buzzing hum of predatory gossip. I stood quietly near a towering, overly elaborate floral arrangement of white orchids, holding a simple glass of sparkling water, simply watching the spectacle. It did not take long for the vultures to circle. Hector spotted me from across the room and began his deliberate, highly calculated approach. Like a king holding court, he moved with a theatrical swagger, drawing a flock of eager aunts, uncles, and cousins in his wake. Aunt Beatrice practically vibrated with excitement, adjusting her heavy pearl necklace, while my cousin Juliana hid a malicious smirk behind her bone china teacup. They gathered around us in a tight, suffocating semicircle, their eyes bright with the morbid anticipation of a public execution. They had all been waiting 14 years for this exact moment. Hector stopped a few feet away, swirling a finger of amber scotch in his heavy crystal glass. He looked me up and down, his lips curling into a deeply patronizing sneer that he made sure everyone could see. "So, Eden," he began, his voice artificially loud, expertly designed to carry across the suddenly quiet room. "Tell us all about this magnificent, independent life of yours. I saw you pull up earlier, a mid-sized domestic rental car. How wonderfully practical of you. And that dress. No designer labels, no custom stitching, very quaint. I suppose high fashion and luxury are a bit out of reach when you are busy saving the world on a minimum wage salary. Are you still waiting tables? Or did you finally upgrade to managing a retail store?" A few of the cousins exchanged amused, pitying glances. A soft, mocking chuckle rippled through the gathered crowd of relatives. "I must say, it is exactly the pathetic picture I painted all those years ago," Hector continued, taking a slow, arrogant sip of his drink. Clearly relishing the sound of his own voice. "You walked out of a multi-million-dollar legacy because your delicate sensibilities were supposedly offended. And look at what that cheap, manufactured morality got you. Absolutely nothing. You are 35 years old, standing here with no assets, no status, and no future. I warned you that the real world would chew you up and spit you out. I told you that childish idealism does not pay the rent." He paused dramatically, clearly waiting for me to flush with embarrassment, to cast my eyes to the polished floor, or to frantically defend my life choices. I did none of those things. I simply took a slow sip of my water, my face perfectly impassive. The profound, unbothered silence seemed to unnerve him, disrupting the script he had written in his head. So he quickly pivoted to his favorite subject on earth, himself. "Meanwhile, the company you turned your back on is about to enter its absolute golden age," he boasted, his chest puffing out with manufactured pride. He swept his hand around the room, making sure every single relative was hanging on to his every word. "Next week, I am finalizing a monumental deal. A colossal acquisition by one of the most powerful, exclusive investment funds on the East Coast. They are buying us out for an absolute fortune. We are talking hundreds of millions of dollars. It is the victory of a lifetime. I am cementing the Gonzalez legacy for the next century, proving to everyone that I am, and always will be, the ultimate winner." It was a spectacular, pathetic lie. Thanks to the exhaustive, highly classified dossiers sitting on my desk back at the Veritas Axiom headquarters, I knew for a fact that his company was bleeding to death. He was drowning in massive, insurmountable debt, facing 3 separate federal audits for tax evasion, and was exactly 4 days away from declaring total bankruptcy. The monumental deal he was bragging about was actually a desperate, humiliating fire sale just to keep him out of federal prison. The irony was so rich, it was practically intoxicating. But I kept my expression entirely blank. My continued, terrifying calmness deeply aggravated him. The smug satisfaction on his face began to curdle into bitter, genuine anger. He stepped closer, dropping the performative volume and adopting a harsh, venomous tone meant only to wound me personally. "You ruined your own life for absolutely nothing, Eden," he spat, his eyes wide with desperate malice, the veins in his neck beginning to show. You are a complete failure. And where is this supposed husband of yours? Did he finally get tired of carrying your dead weight? Did some pathetic working-class man run away because he could not stand the constant, suffocating stench of your failure? I did not flinch. I slowly lowered my glass and glanced down at the sleek, unbranded platinum watch on my left wrist. It was exactly 3:45 in the afternoon. I looked back up into his furious, desperate eyes, and a slow, genuine smile finally touched my lips. He had an emergency board meeting to settle a major corporate acquisition, I replied, my voice soft, melodic, and terrifyingly calm. But he just arrived. The heavy double doors of the banquet hall did not simply open. They were thrust apart with a commanding force that seemed to suck all the stagnant, perfumed air right out of the room. The low, buzzing hum of malicious gossip from my relatives instantly evaporated into a heavy, deathly quiet. Outside the entrance, framed by the gray, miserable drizzle of the afternoon, a formidable convoy of 4 massive, matte black, bulletproof sport utility vehicles had just aggressively mounted the front curb. The synchronized slamming of those heavy armored car doors echoed into the parlor like the rhythmic beating of a war drum. Leading the procession, stepping over the threshold with the absolute confidence of a conquering general, was Julian Vance. He looked immaculate in a dark charcoal bespoke suit that seemed to absorb the dim, yellowed lighting of the room. Flanking him with terrifying military precision was a dense phalanx of his top executive assistants, severe crisis managers, and 3 of the most vicious, highly compensated corporate litigators on the eastern seaboard. They carried thick, reinforced leather briefcases that looked heavy enough to hold the fate of entire nations. Their collective presence was entirely overwhelming. The temperature in the room plummeted by several degrees. Every single relative froze in place. Teacups halted halfway to trembling mouths. Breaths were caught and held in tight chests. But no one had a more violent, visceral reaction than the man standing just a few feet away from me. The heavy crystal glass slipped right out of Hector's suddenly lifeless fingers. It hit the polished hardwood floor, shattering into 100 glittering shards, splashing top-shelf amber scotch across the immaculate toes of his expensive Italian leather shoes. He did not notice the mess. He did not even flinch at the sharp sound. All the blood drained violently from his face in a matter of seconds, leaving a sickly ashen-gray pallor behind his deep wrinkles. His eyes widened to a point of pure terror. He recognized the man walking toward us. Every desperate chief executive officer drowning in massive corporate debt knew the face of the reclusive billionaire who controlled the global financial markets. Julian was the ghost investor, the absolute savior Hector had been praying to for the last 6 months. He was the mythical head of the massive equity fund that held the exclusive power to either resurrect the dying Gonzalez empire or bury it forever under a mountain of federal audits. The sudden realization short-circuited Hector's brain completely. The cruel, mocking tyrant who had just spent the last 10 minutes viciously tearing me down completely vanished. In a fraction of a second, he transformed into a desperate, fawning sycophant. He hastily smoothed down the lapels of his suit jacket with visibly trembling hands, trying to compose a picture of professional success. In his desperate, blinding rush to secure his financial salvation, he actually shoved me roughly by the shoulder. He physically pushed his own daughter out of his path as if I were nothing more than an inconvenient piece of furniture blocking his road to victory. He practically tripped over his own feet to intercept Julian in the middle of the room. "Mr. Vance," Hector exclaimed, his voice cracking with a pathetic, high-pitched desperation that I had never heard in all my 35 years of life. He thrust out his right hand, his face stretched into a grotesque, eager grin that looked painful to maintain. "What an absolute honor to have you here. I am Hector Gonzalez. We have that massive capital injection scheduled for a final review next week. I had absolutely no idea you would be attending my wife's service. Your presence here is a tremendous privilege for our family. If my team had known you were coming, We would have arranged a proper private reception for you and your esteemed associates. Julian did not break his stride. He did not slow his pace by a single fraction. He did not even glance down at Hector's desperately outstretched hand. He looked straight ahead, his jaw locked in a hard, unforgiving line, and simply walked past Hector as if the man were completely invisible. He moved through the crowd of gaping relatives like a shark cutting effortlessly through shallow water. The humiliation of that single silent dismissal hung in the air, incredibly heavy and suffocating. Hector stood entirely frozen in the middle of the parlor, his hands still awkwardly suspended in the empty space, his frantic smile slowly melting into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock and profound confusion. Julian stopped exactly 3 inches away from me. The cold, impenetrable aura he projected to the room instantly softened into something deeply warm and fiercely protective. He reached out, his strong hands gently cupping my shoulders, grounding me in the chaotic, spinning silence of the room. He leaned down and pressed a warm, lingering kiss to my forehead. When he finally turned his head to address the room, his voice was rich, commanding, and deliberately amplified so that every single person, from the furthest corner to the trembling man standing just behind him, would hear every single syllable clearly. "I sincerely apologize for the delay, my darling," Julian said smoothly, keeping his protective arms securely wrapped around my waist. Traffic was completely gridlocked on the interstate due to the storm. However, I cleared my entire schedule. There is absolutely no way the chairman of Veritas Axiom could be absent on a day like today. A collective sharp gasp swept through the crowd. Aunt Beatrice physically staggered backward, clutching a cold marble pillar for support, her knuckles turning entirely white. Cousin Juliana dropped her teacup entirely, the fine porcelain exploding against the wooden baseboards. The name Veritas Axiom was a terrifying legend even to these insulated trust fund socialites. They knew exactly what that company was capable of doing to a business. But Hector looked as though all the air had been violently sucked from his lungs. His eyes darted wildly, frantically, between my perfectly calm face and Julian's authoritative, protective stance. The cognitive dissonance was tearing his mind apart. He could not process the impossible reality unfolding right in front of him. Julian slowly turned his head, finally acknowledging the trembling man he had completely ignored just a moment prior. His gaze was devoid of any warmth, any pity, or any mercy. It was the clinical, absolute stare of an executioner analyzing the condemned. "Good afternoon, Mr. Gonzalez," Julian said, the syllables crisp and lethal. "You seem entirely confused. Perhaps your expensive legal team failed to thoroughly explain the intricate corporate structure of the buyout you are so desperately relying on. You see, the equity fund you have been begging on your hands and knees to partner with is not the primary corporate entity. It is merely a minor secondary subsidiary operating under a much larger global umbrella. The person who authorized the acquisition, the exact person who quietly purchased every single penny of your toxic debt over the last 48 hours, is the actual owner of that umbrella." Julian paused intentionally, letting the agonizing, suffocating silence stretch out for 4 full seconds. The entire room held its breath. Julian then looked down at me with profound, unmistakable reverence before turning back to deliver the final, devastating blow. "The person who now completely owns your company, your frozen assets, and your entire generational legacy is my wife, Eden." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the terrifying quiet of a complete vacuum. I watched Hector's entire constructed reality fracture into dust right before my eyes. The supreme arrogance, the untouchable pride, the toxic masculinity, and the lifelong belief in his own absolute superiority were systematically fed into a wood chipper. His jaw worked soundlessly, trying to form words that no longer existed in his vocabulary. His shoulders slumped forward rapidly as the invisible weight of his monumental defeat crashed down upon him. His knees actually buckled slightly. He was completely, utterly ruined. Not by a faceless corporate competitor, not by a sudden stroke of bad luck in the market. He was completely destroyed by the exact same young woman he had thrown out into a freezing rainstorm 14 years ago. The daughter he had starved, discarded, and mocked had returned. She did not come back crawling to beg for scraps from his table. She came back, standing taller than he ever could, and completely swallowed his entire world whole. Hector stumbled backward, his polished leather shoes scraping awkwardly against the hardwood floor. The full, crushing weight of his reality finally anchored itself in his mind. The absolute fate of his generational empire, his massive wealth, and his precious social standing now rested entirely in the palm of the very woman he had viciously mocked exactly 5 minutes ago. The supreme, towering arrogance that had defined his entire existence completely evaporated, replaced instantly by a raw, suffocating terror. Sensing the dramatic shift in power, the surrounding relatives immediately attempted to change their allegiances. Aunt Beatrice stepped forward, her face twisting into a frantic, sycophantic smile, opening her mouth to offer shallow praise and pretend she had always been on my side. But before she could take a second step, Julian's elite security detail moved with synchronized, silent precision. The men in charcoal suits seamlessly formed a solid, impenetrable wall of broad shoulders between me and the bloodline I no longer belonged to. The message was clear. The distance between us was no longer just emotional. It was an absolute, insurmountable gulf of power that they would never be allowed to cross. Hector stood isolated. For the first time in his entire life, the tyrant was forced to lower his head. He looked at me, his chest heaving, his eyes entirely hollowed out by defeat. When he finally spoke, his voice was a broken, hoarse rasp that barely carried over the silence of the room. "Are you going to crush me entirely?" he asked, the words trembling on his lips. "Is this how you take your revenge on me for that night in the rain?" I looked into the eyes of the man who had terrified my youth. I searched my own heart for the fiery satisfaction of vengeance, the dark thrill of the kill. I found absolutely none. There was no arrogant gloating in my chest. There was only a profound, settling peace. I reached into the pocket of my coat and retrieved the final folded letter my mother had hidden for me inside that wooden box. I held it out, pressing the delicate paper into his trembling hand. "Mother once told me a very important truth," I replied, my voice completely devoid of malice, carrying only the gentle weight of absolute certainty. She said the greatest revenge is not destroying another person. The greatest revenge is simply proving that they no longer have any influence over your life. Hector stared down at his late wife's familiar handwriting, his breath hitching audibly in his throat. "I am not going to ruin the company," I continued, speaking clearly to the broken man. "I will not destroy the livelihoods of the thousands of innocent employees who depend on those paychecks. But your reign as a dictator is officially over. You will tender your immediate and unconditional resignation by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. My firm will install a completely new board of directors. You will retain a silent minority share to live out your days, but you are stripped of all executive authority forever. You will never make another decision for this family or this empire again." I did not wait for his response. There was nothing left to say. I turned smoothly, slipping my hand into the warm, waiting crook of Julian's arm. Together we walked away from the stunned silence of the parlor. I did not look back, but the echoes of the room told the final story. Hector collapsed heavily into a velvet accent chair, entirely defeated. He sat there clutching the worn letter, surrounded by the shattered glass of his own making. In that suffocating silence, the ultimate truth finally dawned on him. The most agonizing punishment life could ever inflict upon him was not the loss of his bank accounts. It was the eternal, irreversible loss of the greatest daughter he could have ever known. Julian and I walked out through the heavy oak doors and back into the open air. The violent storm had finally broken. The freezing drizzle had stopped entirely, and a soft, golden ray of sunlight was piercing through the heavy gray clouds, reflecting warmly off the wet pavement. Julian opened the door of the heavy vehicle for me. I stepped inside, feeling a deep, profound lightness settling into my bones. It was a completely peaceful, definitive conclusion. The heavy, suffocating curtain of the past had officially closed, and I was, at long last, completely and beautifully free. Thank you so very much for taking the time to listen to my story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please let me know in the comments section below. If you found today's journey compelling and wish to support the channel, please consider helping us with just a $1 donation. You can easily do this by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by using the link provided in the description and pinned comment. Your generous support allows us to pay our dedicated team, helping them provide for their families and enabling us to continue creating these meaningful stories for you. Thank you again, and take care.